Chapter 12. The Queen's Personal Bodyguard. After some not very eventful leave, I was assigned to the training wing of the Irish Guards, after a battalion reshuffle. I was also waiting to be given my posting orders for my next job, and my interview would be conducted in an unorthodox location. I recall being in a sergeant's mess one particular happy hour, when the regimental sergeant major had unconventionally invited the commanding officer in for drinks. This was out of the ordinary, and his presence in the mess bar was killing the atmosphere. The commanding officer made a beeline towards myself and Frank, then, without any prompt, stated that he couldn't make his mind up whether he liked or disliked me, because when he asked me a question, I gave him a direct and honest answer. By this stage in the afternoon, I was already a few beers in, so replied with, "I have the answer to your conundrum, sir. Don't ask me any more questions, then." The sergeant's mess erupted with laughter, and the tension then eased. I didn't know this at the time, but I was being interviewed for my next job role. When he went on to question me about why I had joined the Irish Guards and what the connection was to Manchester, I informed the commanding officer about my Irish lineage. Then I explained about how the Manchester Ship Canal was built in the late 1900s with Irish labour, and as a result, it had connected the Irish Sea directly to the Manchester docks, bypassing Liverpool in the process, thus negating the historic Dublin-Liverpool connection and bringing Irish workers and settlers directly to Manchester. Furthermore, it reminded him that two of our Victoria Cross recipients were also from the Manchester area. In fact, our latest Military Cross recipient from Iraq was also a Mancunian. This conversation would go down in sergeant's mess folklore with some even citing, Pato, that I had handouts and even delivered a full PowerPoint presentation. The following week, I would be informed that I would be posted to my hometown of Manchester as a recruiting sergeant. This was a direct result of the essay that I had written on recruiting and retention whilst in Iraq. But everyone seamlessly forgets this fact. I was happy with this 2-year post, as I had genuinely believed that I was destined to die on Optelic 10. I was 28 years old and had completed 5 operational tours in my first 10 years as a soldier, and was psychologically burnt out. The high tempo of army life was beginning to take its toll, both physically and mentally. Up until this point in my military career, I'd never given a second thought to what comes after the rank of platoon sergeant. Now it was clear that as my days of leading men on the battlefield were numbered, I would foreseeably become a second-tier logistical soldier, which was the inevitable consequence of promotion. For the first time in my career, I began to think about life after the army and what comes next. It was this realization and self-awareness of a future civilian life that would help me to gradually break free from my indoctrination and codependency on army life, and this was a deciding factor in accepting the recruiting position. On my recruiting course, much of the emphasis was centered around political correctness and equality and diversity training, which I found quite surprising. Sure, I had witnessed the ongoing sectarian racism within my battalion, but racism regarding skin colour was never an issue. Within the infantry, you were merely judged on your character and soldiering ability. It was that simple. However, this racism awareness training was specifically targeted towards the British Muslim community. I can recall that we were all informed by an external civilian speaker that we were all racists, and that we had to adapt our outlook to recruit more ethnic minorities. As one can imagine, this opening statement didn't sit well with the military students, as it had been delivered from an external civilian speaker, and was possibly a reflection of society at that time. Furthermore, we couldn't understand why the recruiting emphasis was directed towards the Muslim community. Looking back, maybe this was human intelligence-led, as they required more applicants from an Asian background to be able to effectively assimilate into the current Middle Eastern operational environment. I was personally taken back by this, and as I had always taken pride in my small contribution to the liberation of mainly Muslim Kosovo and Iraqi people, and in doing so, helping them to gain their independence, then again, the British Army was always reactive. Therefore, I cannot help but wonder what incidents had occurred previously for such diversity training to be implemented in the first place. I do recall one such racist incident, when I'd thrown an association member out of the Irish Guard sergeant's mess. This was not the thing to do, as these members were guests and were treated like royalty. But after I had overheard him referring to the Iraqis as ragheads, and some other more derogatory words, he had to go. He was a former soldier from the 70s, where racism was rife and institutionally accepted. Looking back, he was no longer in the British Army, but reflected wider society. So maybe this training was actually needed, despite not being welcomed. From a 2003 research article, 42% of the ethnic minorities interviewed stated that racism and lack of equal opportunities had prevented them from joining the British Armed Forces. Furthermore, the Labour government wanted all public services to reflect the wider society. In the armed forces, only 1.7% of personnel originated from an ethnic minority background, despite making up 7% of the national population at the time of the study. Thus, this drive was solely political, as the fire service at the time was less diverse, with only 1.6% of its firefighters being from ethnic groups. Identity politics are not necessarily a bad thing, but I felt that this inclusion of ethnic minorities felt somewhat forced and lacked sincerity. As the course progressed, we conducted role-playing exercises that all of the students, including myself, found odd. We were taught sales techniques used by car salesmen and how to subconsciously manipulate customers into buying needless products. I fundamentally disagreed with these training methods, as we were not selling encyclopedias. We were selling a hazardous lifestyle that could potentially be fatal. There are very few occupations where on entry you write a blank check for your life, and I fundamentally believe that we had to be completely honest and transparent with the young men and women who were interested in joining the British Army. Yet, throughout this course, I kept my opinions to myself, as these requirements had to be completed to pass the course. However, once in post, I could be honest and open, using what I had seen from my own experiences. I took over my post in the March, and was very much learning the ropes. But by the end of June, there had already been 20 British soldiers killed in Afghanistan. I'd been consciously noticing the increases in British fatalities in Afghanistan while on Optelic 10, and it was strategically obvious that as combat operations in Iraq were drawing down, our commitment in Afghanistan would increase. Part of me felt guilty for not being over there, as I was in a safe, sedentary job, but the other part of me felt a sense of relief. The news seemed to continually show clips of the Union Jack-draped coffins of my fallen brothers being repatriated at the small town of Wootton Bassett. I dealt with this as I had been previously accustomed to, and it was not uncommon to finish the day's work at 5 o'clock and directly hit the town. After all, this was the city centre lifestyle of the single man, and all of the other recruiters participated. Drinking your problems away was just how we deal with our suppressed emotions, and was still an accepted cultural practice. Ironically, in the immediate aftermath of the death of British service personnel, we would be inundated with applicants wishing to sign up. I would personally provide these applicants with just information, then turn them away, but not before asking them to complete some further research. These patriotic young people may have been joining for the wrong reasons and were a recruiter's dream, but I wanted to make sure they knew exactly what they were getting into. I would always explain the risks, especially for those who desired a career in the infantry. But like myself many years before, some kids just want to fight due to the unhealthy romantic nature that attracts certain people to military life. In my experience, these were from the more deprived areas of society, and like myself, when I was in their position, they craved structure and stability. Traditionally, those sent to recruiting officers were either injured or were seeing out their final few years of service. If a soldier was non-deployable due to medical reasons, then they may have found themselves stuck in a careers office indefinitely with minimal opportunity for promotion. As a result of this, I immediately stood out, as I had recent combat experience. I'd been a recruit instructor and could advise potential trainees on what to expect in training, and I was young enough to build up a rapport with the potential recruits. I would keep myself fit and was able to play rugby at the weekends. It really was like having a civilian job with an annual fitness test. I would always run the 1.5-mile fitness assessment with potential recruits, and in those 2 years, I would never be beaten. Despite being almost 30, I could still complete it in under 8.5 minutes. I recall being at Fulwood Barracks in Preston for our annual fitness test, which was being supervised by a very young physical training instructor, PTI, and he was quite abusive about us recruiters, as some of them were slightly out of shape and didn't actually physically look like what one would expect of a soldier. I asked about the route and was rudely informed that all we were required to do was to follow him. This was a basic 3-lap circuit, and before long, I decided to increase the pace. I remembered what Paddy had done to me the previous year in Iraq, and before long, this PTI couldn't keep up. He would later explain that I had an advantage, as he was wearing trousers, whereas I was wearing shorts. As excuses go, this one was the worst that I'd ever heard, as this PTI had dropped out of the race to avoid any further embarrassment. I was a hero amongst these out-of-shape recruiters, and somehow everyone managed to pass the fitness test that day. Maybe this was because we had all finished before our PTI, who was timing us, as someone had run him into the ground. I quickly became accustomed to the perks of the civilian world, and was able to detach myself from the toxic alpha male-orientated environment of battalion life. There was no rank in the office, and for once I was known simply as Paul, which I found quite refreshing. I enjoyed being able to plan my weekends, and I could actually book future social events, such as holidays. I enjoyed reconnecting with my school friends. As for the past decade, I'd rarely been home. However, our social interests differed, as many of them were secretly heavy recreational drug users, and this had never interested me. This was part of the reason that I would mainly socialize with the other military personnel in the careers office, as I was still disconnected from the civilian world. Before Optelic 10, I had become emotionally detached and consumed by survivor's guilt, which made me believe that I was unworthy to be loved or cared for by another person, especially a girlfriend or future wife. However, Having survived my yearned-for death on my second tour of Iraq, towards the end of my time as a recruiter, I would buy my own home and move into it with my future wife, Jane. We'd been friends since school, and she made her move on me after a party that I had hosted, and I initially rejected her advances. I had become emotionally disconnected and genuinely believed that I wasn't worth loving, and as such, I would avoid being in a relationship, or just blatantly sabotage them, and would consistently, purposely push people away. For some strange reason, Jane stayed around, despite my best efforts, and this helped me to regain some of my lost humanity. It would be the love from Jane that would gradually, over time, help me break the shackles of my military indoctrination, and this would allow me to eventually prioritize my family over the mission. These days, my family is exclusively my mission. At times, many soldiers can develop a narcissistic personality that feeds within the constructs of the military environment. I, for one, had always prioritized the needs of the British Army, the mission above all else. If this meant sacrificing a relationship, then so be it. I had returned to Iraq to die, and now I was lost, and I felt that I lacked military purpose. Being in the recruiting world didn't help me either, as I was surrounded by second-tier logistical soldiers who lacked motivation and ambition, whereas I was very much the career soldier, or at least I told myself this, as I was caught in the pension trap. The daily working atmosphere in the careers office was different to what I had previously experienced, as most of the other sergeants were washed up and wouldn't be eligible for further promotion. This established a pleasant work environment that was the polar opposite to what I experienced in the battalion, whereas in the Irish Guards, it was very much a relentless pissing contest, dominated by overinflated egos. This was very negative and was encouraged, which created a dog-eat-dog culture in the race for promotion, in which I seldomly participated. I naively thought that promotions were earned through hard work, and it was only in my final years in the army that I finally understood that promotions were awarded by successfully playing the political game. Regardless of the workplace politics, I had easily established myself as a prolific recruiter, not only for the Irish Guards, but also for the wider army. What was alarming, though, was the minimal qualifications that were required to join the infantry. Minors with no academic qualifications could join the infantry at age 15 and 9 months, with consent from their legal guardian. These boy soldiers in the infantry would amount to a third of all junior applications, and just like myself at that age, they would fully buy into the British Army's values and standards, becoming easily indoctrinated in the process. What even now still makes me chuckle to myself is that I would reel some of these potential recruits in with the Queen's personal bodyguard line, which was still amazingly very effective in coercing young men into a life in the Guards. I was always open and honest about the dangers of life in the army, and often spoke about my own battlefield exploits, which, astonishingly, only further encouraged some applicants to pursue a career in the infantry. Some young men and women will always be attracted by the ill-perceived romantic association to warfare, regardless of the associated and very real risks. However, there are times when I feel a tremendous amount of guilt for the soldiers that I recruited, who were either injured or possibly killed on operational deployments, such as Nathan. Some young people would have joined the armed forces regardless of what was advised to them by their parents or a recruiter, and Nathan was one such applicant. Nathan wanted to be just like me, and, in a way, regarded me as a role model. He successfully passed recruit and infantry training, and even reached the dizzy heights of the sergeant's mess in the Irish Guards, and was unfortunately medically discharged after 11 years' service. He is currently wheelchair-bound after sustaining a spinal injury in Afghanistan. The increased dangers to the infantry soldiers are highlighted in Article 34 in the House of Commons Defence Committee Future Army 2020 9th Report of Session 2013-14, in which it acknowledges the increased risk of fatality for the infantry. Soldiers who enlist as minors are disproportionately likely to join the Army's frontline roles because these have the lowest age and qualification entry requirements. Consequently, they face the greatest risk of death or serious injury once they turn 18 and can be deployed. For example, the infantry contains 1/3 of all the Army's minors, even though it comprises only 1/4 of the Army overall. Infantry fatality and casualty rates in Afghanistan are 5 times those faced by soldiers in the rest of the Army. Article 35 of the same review highlights the risk to those young infantry applicants from disadvantaged backgrounds with few qualifications than their adult equivalent as being in a greater risk category, and that joining the infantry is not in their best interest. Bearing in mind that a vast majority of career soldiers in my generation were boy soldiers from disadvantaged backgrounds, and that we were 5 times more likely to be injured in Afghanistan, this begs the question as to accountability for the aftercare of those vulnerable soldiers. The upsetting truth is that on medical discharge, they often fall on hard times and are reliant on military charities for financial, physical, and psychological support. The recruitment process has now completely changed as a result of austerity and manning reductions. It is now completely online, with only one physical interaction with a serving soldier before attending a recruit development and selection centre. Yes, this is more cost-effective, but it has completely removed the nurturing element from the serving Army recruiter. We were the ones who could identify the suitability of applicants, including any red flags, which was often the case. Effectively, we were responsible for screening the mental suitability of the applicants and advising them accordingly, which, more often than not, disappointed them. For example, a well-built tall chap of 6'4" would not be suitable in one of the cavalry regiments, as he wouldn't be comfortable within the tight confines of a tank, and may be best suited to the Royal Artillery or Infantry Regiment. It was this personal rapport, nurturing and knowledge that allowed us to successfully advise applicants, as well as weeding out those who were not psychologically fit to join the ranks of the British Army. It was whilst I was at the Careers Office that I was having concerns about my actions in Iraq in 2003. Specifically that airstrike on the village in the initial days of the war. Being alone, without the high-tempo distractions and pace of normal military duties, I was finally allowed to reflect on my own memories from Iraq. Maybe this was brought on by the very public persecution of British soldiers by the Iraq Historic Allegations Team, IHAT. This would cost the British taxpayer £59.7 million. Yet no British soldier would ever be convicted. However, it did ruin the lives of all the soldiers involved, as well as their families. One such soldier who was illegally pursued was Guardsman Joseph McCleary, from my own regiment. He was one of 4 soldiers from the Household Division who were wrongfully hunted by the IHAT. McCleary was snatched from his platoon lines in 2004 and intimidated by the Special Investigation Branch of the Royal Military Police. This was another attempted shakedown by using the shock of capture/arrest to coerce a confession out of McCleary, a betrayal by the very institution that he had given his life to. McCleary's story has many similarities to Piotrowski's regarding the lack of backing from the Ministry of Defence in supporting our soldiers, apart from the fact that McCleary was innocent and that there was no substantial evidence, whereas Piotrowski was guilty. The IHAT case was merely founded on allegations, yet in the case of McCleary, he would undergo a traumatizing 8-week trial. McCleary had to wait 2 years for his trial and was segregated from his battalion during that time. He was immediately deemed guilty by the senior commanders of the British Army even before the trial had begun and was offered no support. He was cast out. Whilst isolated and under the threat of a 15-year prison sentence, McCleary began to drink heavily and went to a dark place, and even tried to kill himself, only to be fortunately saved by his brother. Then, after a second attempt to hang himself, he was sectioned under the Mental Health Act. It would appear that he was immediately deemed guilty by the Ministry of Defence, as along with the IHAT, both these organisations represented the British government, and they could not support our soldiers due to the ongoing bad press surrounding the illegal war. McCleary states in a Leggett podcast interview in 2021 that whilst in the army he was not allowed to show emotional pain, but whilst separated from his military brothers and under enormous stress and anxiety, his emotions overwhelmed him. McCleary found therapy difficult as he no longer wanted to live as a result of his own demons and his overwhelming anxiety. The Ministry of Defence was informed of his current situation, but he was abandoned, and no aftercare assessment for his deteriorating mental health was ever provided by the Army. He had been cut off, abandoned, left to rot, with his inner demons eating away at him. McCleary was once a proud soldier with a bright career ahead of him. He had deployed on 2 operational tours and had been to war. He was willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for his country, and now found himself isolated without any support. He was treated like he was guilty, and he couldn't understand why he was not getting any support from the institution that had sent him to war. He then spiraled out of control to drink and drug misuse, and the suicide attempts continued. At his lowest, he was borderline to almost becoming an addict due to this betrayal and being cast aside. When the trial began and the Iraqi witnesses were questioned, they stated that they were promised compensation and that their only motivation was money. Phil Shiner, the solicitor responsible for pursuing British soldiers, was struck off the solicitor's register in 2017 after being found guilty of telling blatant lies for his own financial gains, and had 12 charges of misconduct proven against him. In a time when the British Army was ill-equipped and soldiers were dying in Iraq and Afghanistan because of a lack of sufficient protective personal equipment, this highlights how little consideration was given to the safety of individual soldiers, as almost £60 million was provided by the government to pursue false claims against individuals. This money could have been better spent in providing better armoured vehicles for our deployed troops, or even a substantially improved welfare support package at a time when we were overstretched. McCleary is just one example of a good man who lost everything as a result of the IHAT's illegal pursuit of British soldiers. Once found innocent, he was given the option to remain in the army, and he refused. Why would he soldier on after being thrown to the wolves? Been deemed guilty from the start, abandoned, and offered no support. IHAT was set up by the government, but not one soldier was ever prosecuted. McCleary would continue to be investigated, yet would continue to be found innocent every single time. He would be primarily informed by the press about future investigations, and this traumatized him even further. The government didn't even have the courtesy to inform him before the press, which is appalling treatment of a patriot, as he was continuously thrown under the bus. This raises so many questions, but for me, the one regarding loyalty springs to mind. We were taught to be loyal to the needs of the British Army. Yet as soon as there's an inkling of bad publicity, the loyalty is replaced by abandonment. McCleary still suffers from anxiety and low confidence and is still traumatized by the whole ordeal. Thankfully, he's found stability. He's overcome his inner demons and has a loving family. But I cannot help but feel sorrow for him. I never knew McCleary when we served together, but his story is one of inspiration as he continues to overcome this horrendous treatment. In January 2016, David Cameron announced a change to legal aid that would prevent no-win, no-fee cases, which included the banning of foreigners for the eligibility of seeking British tax-funded legal aid. To this day, new legislation continues to be written to safeguard our soldiers, but this political rhetoric is only as good as the government of the day allows. I, for one, was often worried that the IHAT would come looking for me, although, like McCleary, I knew that I didn't commit any war crimes, yet the inner voice inside me was always saying that I needed to be punished. Maybe this was my own inner demons within my subconscious, eating away at me from my battlefield experience. Maybe being a careers officer in a non-military work environment had allowed some of my suppressed emotions to surface. Regardless, these emotions would have to be kept suppressed, as my focus was now on my next deployment in Afghanistan. For 2 years, I had enjoyed living like a civilian. I had my own house and commuted to my 9-to-5 job. I wore the uniform of a soldier, yet I was not a soldier. I was referred to by my Christian name rather than my military rank or nickname, and the soldier in me had become dormant and weak. Then, towards the end of my time within the recruiting world, I would be brought back down to reality when Davy Walker was killed by enemy fire in the Nad Ali district in Helmand province in mid-February 2010. I had known Davy from my time at Catterick instructing recruits, as we'd been part of the same company as Lance Sergeants together, and this was a stark realization of what the job of an infantry soldier really entailed. This rattled me, as on return to my battalion in the coming months, I was aware that the Irish Guards would be deploying in Afghanistan later that year. More specifically, to the Nad Ali district in Helmand province, which at the time was the most dangerous combat zone on the planet. Over the summer of 2010, I was glued to the news as the fighting only intensified, with British forces being engaged in a casualty-intensive guerrilla warfare with the Taliban. I wasn't afraid of deploying to Afghanistan, but I was certainly apprehensive as a result of my 2 years in a civilian job. My time in the careers office had provided me with a necessary break from the non-stop and relentless pace of battalion life. I was able to recharge my batteries, but on the downside, I had finally allowed myself to pass through the looking glass and to experience a normal job. My love for the army was now in the decline, but my commitment remained steadfast. I was shaken by IHAT's persistent pursuit of British soldiers, But all that I had known since I was a boy was the military way. And no matter how much I denied it, I was institutionalized. I was loyal. What is reassuring, though, is that the British Army has now changed its recruiting strategy regarding minors. As under Article 38 of the 2013 Future Army Review, it has finally recognized the following. Current recruitment policy does not respect the best interests of the child and puts minors at significantly increased risk of serious long-term physical and psychological harm compared to adult recruits. Does this mean that boy soldiers such as those from my generation, who endured so many operational deployments, were at an increased danger to psychological risks? Maybe this is a combination of both the brutal instruction practices in recruit training and the inhumane lessons that we were reluctantly taught on the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan. The positive outcome of this is that the British Army has now reduced the percentage of minors that it annually recruits into the military, and that will mean fewer of the Queen's personal bodyguards.